Is Putin pulling out all the stops to finance his war machine, even as Ukraine gets more and more cash from its allies? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a really interesting story from the Kiev Independent about the Russian financial system. And this is one of the things that when you're fighting a war of attrition, as Russia is, it's less about the actual tactical units because there's so high casualties among tactical soldiers that having a brilliant tactician here or there doesn't really make a difference when you're trying to get hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight. But what does make a difference is your ability to be even a little more efficient than your opponent. Or if you're fielding 25,000 soldiers every single month, then if you're able to be 2, 3, 4% more efficient, that results directly in thousands more soldiers on the battlefield. So this is where Russia's best minds are actually thinking. But there's only so much that Putin can do given the constraints he's operating under, right? So since the full-scale invasion of 2022, Russia has had to go, in some ways, all in to funding the war. It's a really tough situation because the Kremlin refuses to put its whole society on a war footing, notably not conscripting, implementing a general conscription or deploying Russian conscripts to Ukraine, but it is focusing on pivoting its economy to a war focus. And but you cannot take your country's resources, extract them, and then destroy them in a war indefinitely, right? War is inherently a poor economic investment in almost all cases. The amount of the blood and treasure that gets expended in a conflict, at least especially in the modern industrial era, is simply not worth it. Right. And so here's how Putin is kind of solving the problem. First off, Russia's national defense spending rising again from the $51 billion US dollars in 2021 up to $120 billion, or 1/3 of the entire Russian government spending here in 2024. So increasing by almost threefold. And this means inherently that Russia needs to take it in a lot of cases from social programs. And this is dangerous because remember, Putin's so afraid of a general backlash against his conflict that he refuses to implement a general conscription, something that would give him the military manpower to likely win the war. But Russian public won't tolerate it. Yet, at the same time, Russia is slowly tightening social spending, right? These are programs that the average Russian depends on. Old age pensions, for example, general health care schemes, veteran pay. All of these things are being cut, right? And they, again, consist of nearly 21% of the Russian budget. And so Russia is increasingly finding itself having to pull more and more sort of fiscal tricks in order to make its budget work, right? Now, before the invasion, Russia was actually running a federal budget surplus of about $7 billion, something that most Western economies don't really have. But it's had to, as the war has dragged on, become more and more desperate, right? Its current budget deficit is around 2% of its total GDP, about $47 billion. And it's expected to be about 1% of GDP here in 2024. Now, some of the ways they're doing it. First off, Russia has had to raise taxes. And if you've studied American history, you know that at least Americans don't really care much for tax hikes. But the Russians seem to be just kind of taking it. There's a 15% tax rate, a tax hike for income exceeding $57,000, which, yes, Russia is a somewhat poorer country than the United States, but $57,000 is the equivalent of like 120,000 in the US. So something that doesn't really target the Russian upper strata. Instead, this is a tax focused on Russia's upper middle class, which is a dangerous target because, as we know, Putin's power base is skewed heavily in favor of the metropoles, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's where kind of the upper middle class Russians who Putin depends on for support really congregate. Now, Putin also depends on kind of ultra nationalists, like the rural kind of the Russian version of like a red state, kind of ultra nationalists support. But again, somebody in the upper middle class is going to be losing the upper middle class would be very, very dangerous for someone like Putin, right? Russia's finance ministry, in fact, last month announced new income tax hikes, including up to 22%, which is very high for Russia, on any income exceeding just $28,000. So again, now Putin is targeting his middle class, again, playing a really dangerous game by punishing these folks. And it's obvious to almost anyone that this is done to fund this war in Ukraine, right? And remember, already it's fairly clear, based on both the level of destruction within Ukraine and on the level of expenditure that the Russian government has done, that there's no way Russia's going to make this back just by seizing economic territory, or even at best he might return to baseline by having sanctions listed if he gets a really, really sweet peace treaty, or he is just willing to withdraw. Likely that would create, in exchange for total sanction lifting. You'll also see the Russian corporate tax raising by almost 20%, right? And mineral production and taxes of raw materials, something that is core to the Russian economy, is also raising by almost 10%. So these kind of taxes are going to really piss off a lot of segments of Russian society, a lot of oligarchs who depend on mineral rights and other kind of raw materials. You're going to, of course, have any large or mid-sized Russian corporation is going to be very upset at this large tax increase, and of course the Russian middle class. And so the fact is that it's obvious to anyone that this is about war spending. And there's a fear that, of course, this may trigger inflation, but it may also trigger it can also trigger a deflation within the civilian sector, a slowing of the civilian sector economy as the defense sector ramps up. But again, that's not a way to run an economy. That's a temporary solution that you can do for 2 years in order to get sort of people back to work and get wages back in pockets. But to do so, particularly in the face of a war that kills off large numbers of your best, most productive workers, able-bodied men, is a really, really playing with fire. But that's not all, right? Russia is also selling a lot of oil and gas, a lot, by bypassing sanctions. And in fact, Russia's oil and gas revenues rose by 28% immediately after the invasion. And while they fell initially as the first round of sanctions hit them, this year Russia's oil and gas revenues are going to increase again. This is because Russian buyers are basically China and India, whose need for raw materials is far greater than their need to score brownie points with the West. And ultimately, the cheap Russian oil, right, the discount that Russia gets to sell it at, makes such a huge difference for an industrializing country, a rising country like China and India, that they just feel that it's too good a deal to turn down. In fact, Russian government's oil and gas revenue in June is set to rise by more than 50% year over year. And this is a huge problem. But the fact is that Russia wouldn't be raising taxes in such an unpopular move if this were sufficient. And we know that Ukraine has made targeting Russian oil infrastructure a big priority. So yes, this is rising, but Ukrainian efforts to target Russian oil infrastructure, they see is kind of Russia's Achilles heel. Again, because it allows them to circumvent Russia's best way to improve kind of their national budget. Right? Russia also uses a few other tricks, like its sovereign wealth fund, to finance military spending. And again, this is sort of a rainy day fund that a country holds. Particularly, this is popular among oil-producing nations. If your nation produces a lot of oil, generally the states collect a certain tax on it because, again, it's oil. It's extracted literally from the soil of your country. And so this tax then funds a sovereign wealth fund that is meant for, well, not funding wars, but it's supposed to ensure balanced budgets or help implement, kind of make these kind of long-term investments that a country might need that might not come from the private sector, either because they're too speculative, they're too big, or because they're too long-term in vision. Of course, the final strategy, which has never backfired on anyone, is printing money. The Russia's money supply rose by 13%. In 2021, but then grew by 24% to 2022. Then it grew by 19% again. So somehow inflation has remained relatively under control in Russia, with just 8, 12, and 7.5% inflation over the last 3 years. But again, some Russian economists argue that the actual inflation figures are much higher, and more worrying is that it's a little bit like the United States. For a decade, the U.S. tried to generate inflation. They tried to print money, to offer banks very, very cheap rates, to reduce the total interest payments. But none of it seemed to work until eventually what happened is what seemed to have occurred is that a glut of money sat in kind of that investment class, right? That's why you had things for about 10 years, companies like Uber, any tech company with a pulse and 3 lines of code would be valued at something like 10 or 100 times revenue. And that valuation, that money, was because there was all this glut of money in the upper financial system, right? It similarly sat in speculative investments like cryptocurrencies. But then at some point, all those speculative assets began to collapse, and that money finally dumped into the durable goods economy, the economy the rest of us live in, right? We don't sit there and feed our families or pay our rent with meme coins, right? We do it with dollars. We purchase homes, we buy groceries, we buy new cars, right? Things that people actually need in the real world. And once that money worked its way into those businesses, inflation began to explode. It was caused by a bunch of other things, including COVID spending and a lot of other insane levels of government spending. But understand that a lot of those conditions are sitting in Russia. And if Russia proves unable, at some point, this money supply increase is going to filter down, right? So right now it's sitting somewhere, likely in kind of defense spending coffers. But at some point, those people that work in the defense industry, or the soldiers who are promised salaries, or defense contractors who get bigger and bigger orders placed, that money is going to get into the real economy of Russia. And you're going to see the money supply increase minus the GDP increase, which is like, I think a few percentage points. That's what you're going to see the inflation rate look like. And when you do, again, combined with higher taxes and higher cost of goods, the Russian consumer is going to absolutely lose their shit. And once they do so, then you're going to see pressure get put on Putin and the Kremlin in order to really alter the fundamental deal, so to speak, between Russia's people and the authoritarian government they tolerate. Now, if you are looking for your own better way to solve your problems, you don't need to print fake money. You don't need to raise your taxes on, your kids maybe. Instead, just get some Strike Gum, guys. Strike Gum is the zero sugar energy drink alternative, and we're having a 4th of July sale. 4th of July sale is 20% off, period. That's it. Wherever you live, whatever you order, just get 20% off. That's it. 4th of July. When you log in, there'll be a big old code here. There it is. Boom. 20% off worldwide, baby. So if you are from the UK, Canada, Mexico, Europe, and you've wanted to get some Strike Gum, now's the chance. All orders over $25. Discount automatically applied at checkout. It's everything, 20% off. So check it out, all right? Even if you're not from America, you can reap the benefits of our Independence Day. That is my gift to you guys. Strike Gum. So check it out. It's only available on strikegum.com. That's the only place you can get the discount. But if you want to check it out and you have Amazon, you can go to Amazon and just punch in Strike Gum. And out it'll go, right? Now, let's talk about Ukraine. Ukraine has an ace in the hole, right? Yeah, they're a smaller country and they're a smaller economy. And they have a lot of the same problems. But they have Big Daddy America bankrolling a lot of their program. So while Russia has to sell oil or raise taxes to purchase new military gear, the United States is like, hey, we've got warehouses full of old stock from the GWAT era, from the Global War on Terror, and we want to buy new stuff. So why don't you guys take this off our hands? In fact, to the tune of $2.3 billion coming up this week in military aid. And it's going to be anti-tank weapons. Yikes for Russia. Big yikes. Interceptors and munitions for Patriot missile batteries and other air defense systems. Right? And most of this, or actually $150 million, is going to come from what's called Presidential Drawdown Authority, and the remainder from the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. That the PDA allows the Pentagon to take weapons from its own stocks, this is the old stuff, and ship them over to Ukraine, stuff that's going to get replaced anyway, right? And the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, of course, is more about putting weapons on long-term contracts. Somebody make it, and they put it out, right? Austin said, quote, "Make no mistake, Ukraine is not alone, and the United States will never waver in our support." Yo, dude, I don't know if you were here like 3 months ago. There was a lot of wavering, FYI. A lot of wavering. Like, let's not say things we don't mean there, Lloyd. Right? But critically, U.S. isn't alone. Up to 50 allies and partners are providing. Now, remember, some of this, you go, providing these weapons, it frees up the Ukrainian budget to handle other things that its Western allies and partners can't necessarily aid them in. So this will include, now for a while the U.S. was providing Ukraine cash to balance its budget. I think the U.S. has backed away from that kind of program because the optics are so bad. And I kind of agree with that. We're happy to support our allies in their fight against Russia, right? By sending them military gear, we're freeing up their funds. But it's that way, if there is a issue with corruption or misappropriation of funds, it's Ukrainian funds that are being misappropriated, right? You can't misappropriate an artillery piece. Just like if I sent you an artillery piece, what would you do with it? You go, oh, I'd sell it. Well, to who, dude? On eBay? Like, you can't like pull a fast one and be like, I don't know how the Azerbaijanis got your M777 howitzer. It's like, no, dude, the howitzers are good for one thing, and that's shooting Russians. So, like, you don't have to worry about military gear of a certain caliber being expropriated because it's military gear of a certain caliber, right? Cash money doesn't quite work as well. So, again, happy to see our tax dollars, our old weapons being used, put to good use, and certainly Ukraine enjoying some advantages that Russia simply doesn't. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to the Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com, including H. Young, Fran Zacharias, Mark, James Porsche, Robin Colburn, Dave Roberts, Donald Moore, Geoffrey Mail, Blank Anonymous, Alpha, Redacted, and Mikhail Sena Odom. I really appreciate you guys, and I appreciate the Lieutenant tier members. Could not do this without you guys. Hopefully you're enjoying the newly redone site and the new benefits for each tier. So you guys should absolutely check it out because, frankly, it's great. Anyway, thanks so much, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.